Good afternoon and welcome to the IICRC Certified Firm webinar series. Today's topic is Documenting Water Mitigation with Purpose by Brandon Burton. Brandon is an approved IICRC instructor in the categories of Applied Structural Drying and Water Damage Restoration and has provided training and consultation to more than 10,000 water damage restoration professionals. He's also a published author in the field. Brandon currently serves as the Vice Chair for the ANSI IICRC S500 Standard Consensus Body and is a past member of the RIA Restoration Council. He's also an accomplished and awarded speaker with Toastmasters International. Before we begin, I'll just ask that if you have any questions during the webinar, to please enter them into the chat section of your go-to platform. We'll try to address any questions you may have throughout the webinar, but we may get back to you at the very end. We'll try to leave some time for some Q&A at the end. And any questions we can't get to during the webinar, we'll do our best to get back to you after the webinar. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Brandon. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. I appreciate it. And I appreciate everybody making the time to join us today for this topic. I know, especially given some of the recent events weather-wise, documentation of drying and a mitigation project can be something that's very difficult to stay on top of. And make sure that we're kind of punching all the items on the list. So I think it's a pretty timely topic. So as we get started, as noted, I'm Brandon Burton. I'm with Next Gear Solutions, previously with Legend Brands, and really here to speak from the perspective of kind of my technical passion for the industry. For the last 20 some odd years, I've been focused on training and education because I have a very strong passion for really helping to simplify the technical in the industry. We have a very diverse industry in terms of what we need to know and understand. And I think that the more we can simplify those messages and the more effectively we can implement them in the field, just the more we raise the bar for the industry as a whole in terms of professionalism. So I thank you for joining me in kind of that effort in the industry. So today we're going to basically take documentation and break it into three buckets. And just to preface that, when I say documentation, we're going to focus specifically on drying documentation and how we document what has been accomplished or is being accomplished in terms of drying a structure. The first bucket we're going to break that into is the purpose of drying documentation. It's very difficult to really have an in-depth discussion on documentation if we don't first understand what it's there for. The second thing we're going to dive into is a couple of definitions, inspection versus monitoring, and understanding the difference between these two very critical terms. They're both important, and unfortunately, they kind of get used interchangeably as terms when they mean two entirely different things, and they're both very important. And then finally, to kind of wrap things up, I'm going to get into a discussion on some systems and methods to help with the efficiency of deploying effective documentation in regards to drying. To start it off, I want to start with a quote. One of my favorite quotes when it comes to education in general is that, if you can't explain it simply, then that means you just don't understand it well enough. And although that would apply to me and my presentation to you, it also applies very directly to your documentation of your work. If your work does not present a very simple message that clearly articulates that your goals have been achieved and it's been done in an efficient and effective manner, then it conveys the wrong message. A lot of people think that overly complicated documentation just makes it look like it was a complex project and worth more money and things like that. And it couldn't be further from the truth. In reality, what you want your documentation to do is to get you paid and to help people understand that you accomplished the goals you set out to achieve. And the more clearly your documentation shows that, the more it shows a command of your subject matter and your area of expertise. So clear documentation that is outlined well around the goals you're setting out to achieve is always going to be to the benefit of all involved. So I don't think Einstein could have put it any better. So with that, like I said, a couple of different buckets. We're going to start first with what is the purpose of documentation. And purpose number one in your documentation is ensuring, number one, that we document where we start from. If you don't document the initial conditions that you arrive and inherit with that mitigation project, then you can't really support all of the services that you provide in your initial response. There's a couple of different ways that I could explain this, but probably one of the most important is that although this often gets overlooked and people assume that, if it's wet, why do I need to document that it's wet? We all know that it's wet. But if we overlook that and we don't put a stake in the ground saying this is how wet it was and this is what was wet when we started, and then we go back later on to defend the decisions that we made about classification of the loss, about the severity of the damage, extent of migration, what was affected, what wasn't affected, or even defending what wasn't affected in areas like kitchens and other things like that where there could be pre-existing damages. If I don't have that well delineated and documented, I really don't have anything to stand on. So it's very critical that we first begin with the approach in our drawing documentation of creating a clear story of where the loss started. What were the conditions upon our initial arrival? And we'll get into that in some detail in a little bit. The second purpose in the documentation is to take credit for the progress that's being made. I would argue that your role as a mitigation contractor, as a drying contractor, is to minimize the time necessary for that structure to return to a normal moisture level. You can't change the fact that the building got wet. It's a fact, and it's the reason why you're there. You can't change the fact that the building will eventually be dry. That would occur even if you never showed up on site. Nature would handle it, by itself at some point in time. What you can change is the amount of time that the excess moisture is present. That's where your expertise really comes into play. It's about minimizing the time necessary to restore that normal moisture level in the building. I've often said that water in and of itself really doesn't cause damage. So saying water damage is a bit of a misnomer. Most building materials, just by the simple fact that they got wet, don't necessarily become damaged. What causes the damage is the amount of time that the excess moisture is in contact with those materials. Especially when you're talking about things like wood, for example, the actual structure itself. Most wood can become wet and be restored back to its normal condition. But if you allow that wood to remain wet for an excessive amount of time, then a lot of damages will occur. And then finally, the third purpose in the documentation is to clearly articulate that the drying goals have been achieved. A simple, clear record showing that the structure has returned to a moisture condition that's not going to support additional damages. So these are the three primary purposes. Where you started from, stick that marker in the ground saying, here's where we began. A final state that says, here's what we achieved, and then recording the progress between points 1 and point 3 as you move through the project that validate the drying decisions, the air movers, dehumidifiers, manipulations to structure, et cetera, that you made to get from 1 to 3. So with all of that said for purpose, now let's take a look at those definitions that I mentioned. Like I said, there are two terms that are commonly used to describe your drying documentation. One is inspection. Inspection is, if you just look up the verbatim definition, it's a careful examination or scrutiny, the act of discovering information. That all makes perfect sense. And then we have monitoring, to observe and check the progress or quality of something over a period of time under systematic review. Now, those two terms are very, very different, and they mean very different things. And you, as a drying contractor, need to do both. But you're not doing both at the same time, and each serves a very distinct purpose. They have a separate skill set. And to help you understand the difference, I want to give you an analogy. Inspection is like a picture. All right, so here I have a picture, and this picture of this system, this hurricane, obviously tells a very significant story about the intensity of this particular system. I can see in kind of some purple lines there that it's in and around some geography, some land masses of some sort, but I have no idea, just from this picture, other than the fact that this is a very intense storm, I have no idea where this storm is headed. In order to understand where this storm is headed, I would not need a picture, I would need a video. So I need something that's going to show me the direction that this storm is moving. And that's monitoring. Monitoring is several of those pictures that indicate the direction of something over time with a systematic review. It's the same kind of picture taken from the same place in the same way of the same object. holding my viewpoint stationary so that I can see the direction that this system is headed. It's really critical to understand that difference, because in the process of water mitigation, you will inspect. Inspect is typically what you do first, and inspection is careful examination, it's scrutiny, it's the act of discovering all kinds of information so that we understand exactly where we're starting from and basically what we're inheriting. What are you taking responsibility for? Because at the end of the day, when you take on a project, and you've probably heard this said before, if there is a condition that is present that you do not document initially, then you likely are going to own that condition at some point in time, because it's really hard to say that was there before if your documentation doesn't say it was there before. And that can include not only the drying documentation, obviously, it can include any condition that could be blamed on the water or on you, right? So that's the reason why we take lots of pictures of wear, tear, and signs of use, in addition to the effects of water damage. And then we have monitoring. Monitoring is not the detailed process, but the ongoing process. And you're going to hear a theme when I talk a bit more about monitoring and it being a video, that the only way monitoring is effective is if it's consistent. You don't need a lot of detail in monitoring. You don't need to monitor, 30 locations in a single room. I would much rather see 2 or 3 locations in a single room, but done exactly the same way. Same instrument, same setting, same location, same method of documentation, same scale. All of that needs to be held consistent, because if anything changes, then the inconsistency is a variable. The numbers will change, the value will change, and you really have no idea whether or not the true moisture content condition has changed. So it's really important to drive that with consistency. So with that said, let's kind of break the inspection and monitoring into a workflow. There are 3 steps in the workflow of drying documentation. The first step in the workflow is that we begin with the mindset of inspection, and this is determining the initial condition. This is a detailed process, and if you refer to your ANSI IICRC S500, there's a couple of really good sections in that S500 that really detail the type of information that you're looking for in that initial inspection of condition. And I'm going to cite a couple of them here quickly. First, in section 10 of the standard, specifically 10.5, there's a great list of some of the information that you want to collect in that initial contact and information gathering. I'm not going to state all of them here because as a certified firm, hopefully you've got a copy of this document. But I would go to section 10, and specifically 10.5, and compare this against your initial checklist that you use with your field staff. Ensure that these items are covered. Ensure that your initial information gathering forms capture this type of information. In addition to that, to get a bit more specific to water documentation and understanding what impacts there are on your scope and the direction you're headed, if you continue reading down through 10.5 and come to 10.6, there's an even more specific list of some of the things that really need to be documented because they directly affect either your scope and what you're setting out to accomplish, or they are directly in line with things that you don't want to be blamed for, things that you don't want to own if you don't know them ahead of time. So I would refer to that heavily, section 10 of your S500. There's some similar information in section 13 in the structural chapter, but section 10 on your inspections is definitely the place to go. And again, confirm that against your inspection lists and just make sure that you have these covered. So in that detailed process, a few of the things kind of extracted from the S500 that are really critical to document, we want to ensure that we find the absolute edge of migration. That's something that should be discovered, defined, and documented. Now, finding the edge of migration is a simple term, but it can actually be quite complex. In order to know where the true edge of migration is, there are 2 things you have to document. First, you have to document what is wet, but then what a lot of people overlook is you have to document what isn't wet. And let me define that. If I'm moving across the surface with a particular instrument and I find the edge of migration by my instrument indicating that something is not affected, then I need to, in some way, shape, or form, document the location of that instrument in terms of what wasn't affected. The seriousness of that documentation varies depending upon the material types, the assembly type, the building type. In other words, it varies depending upon the risk. But if you're in an area where there are pre-existing water sources, high-risk areas of pre-existing damage or future damage, then this becomes extremely critical. For example, if I was documenting water migration across the kitchen floor and the water migration stopped, a foot short of the cabinetry, and in that cabinetry we have a dishwasher, we have a sink, we have a window facing the exterior, all of those could be sources of past or future water damage that have nothing to do with the intrusion that I'm dealing with. And when somebody remodels that kitchen and removes those cabinets and finds water damage to the subfloor or the wall plates or the drywall behind those cabinets, the first thing that they're going to think about is, we had water damage last year. It must have been ABC Cleaning and Restoration that caused this. So they'll go to your drying documentation and they'll pull up that you found a wet floor. And if you didn't document the dry edge, the edge of the migration, all you documented was wet, wet, wet until about a foot before the cabinetry and then nothing there beyond, you have a risk. You have exposure there, because the only thing that you're going to be able to do to defend the fact that that wasn't affected is say, well, it isn't noted as wet on my report, so it must not have been wet. Well, that may or may not stand. So it's really important to understand that documenting the edge of migration includes not just documenting what is wet. It means documenting what isn't wet. Another way I could say that real quickly before we move on is that you need to inspect and check anything that may be wet and then document what you check. If you checked an area, the reason you checked it is because there was a risk it was wet. Think about why you're checking it. And if there's a risk it was wet, then it should probably end up in your documentation somewhere. Even if it's just in the notes, it needs to be somewhere so that you can memorialize that inspection, that checkpoint, and verify in the future, if necessary, that it was indeed inspected and was unaffected. So find the edge of migration. Document what is and what is not rather affected. And again, this doesn't mean that you have to check every single square inch of the building. You just have to check until you find the edge, right? So if you found the edge of migration, congratulations, you found it. But just, again, give yourself the ammunition you need to note that you've indeed found it. As you're making those inspections, it's really critical to also be digesting and digging into what the assembly components are. Assumptions are very, very dangerous in the inspection process about how a structure is composed and what it's made of, how many layers there are, and what complexity those layers are going to present. So assembly component documentation is also very important, especially when you're dealing with structures that have been in existence for any period of time, where remodel and reconstruction has occurred within that space, and there could be multiple layers on either wall assemblies or flooring assemblies. You never know when you're going to find an exterior wall on the interior of a building from an add-on and have all kinds of stuff in that interior wall assembly that's going to cause havoc to the drying process, and that needs to be identified up front. So identify the assemblies and the components. And then obviously any damages that you discover along the way. Now that's a lot of detail, and that initial inspection is, when I talk about systems and methods for efficiency, it doesn't sound real efficient, and granted it's not. There's not a lot of efficiency that you can put into that initial inspection process because it is a detailed process. Where the efficiency comes is when we move from the inspection process into the monitoring process. If I set my inspection properly and I do a good detailed inspection and identify everything that is wet in the assembly components and the layers, and then from there establish a fewer number of set monitoring points that can be monitored on a daily basis, then this is where the efficiency can come in. It all is based on how well I've set up those monitoring points initially. And I'm going to get into that in some detail here in a second. As we get into that, though, let's remember that monitoring is not like inspection. It's not detail. I don't need an infinite number of locations to monitor. In fact, fewer is probably better because you have a higher likelihood of being consistent if you have a fewer number of points to check. But in that consistent process, here are some of the things that you've got to lock down. First of all, the meter that's being used needs to be noted. It needs to be documented. At the very least, the make and model. Perfect world, it would be the make, model, and the kit number. So the same meter physically ends up on the job each day. I know with some businesses that's not really practical, and it may be impossible to get the same exact meter kit out to the job every day. If that's your particular scenario, and it's highly unlikely you can get kit A out to the same job every day, then I would urge you to implement a secondary process in your business. If you're mixing meter kits on a job, then you need to have at least every other month have some sort of a validation of the instrument calibration. And that doesn't mean you have to bring in some expensive calibration company. And in fact, it's very, very simple to keep a log of your meter calibration. All you need to do is grab all your kits once every other month and put them all in the same piece of fur 2x4 and verify that they're all reading within a close approximation of each other. And do that once a month. And just make sure that kit A, B, C, D, E, and F are all reading approximately 13, if you will, if that's what you're getting on that same sample. And if they're all in agreement with one another, great, wonderful, document it. Keep a clipboard, keep a log back at the office that you've done that once every other month. And that's all that you're going to need if you need to defend any of that data in court at some point in time. But do something to get consistency in the meter used, whether it's the same exact meter, and if it's the same meter, then I don't even care if it's in calibration because it'll be the same off calibration, if you will, every time you inspect with it. But either the same meter, or if you're mixing meters, make sure you have some sort of an internal validation process. The second thing you need to lock down is the setting used. And this is a big one. I find high inconsistency in our industry for understanding the variable settings on an instrument and whether or not a particular setting was used day 1 versus day 2 versus day 3. You've got to lock down the setting. Was it on invasive? Was it on non-invasive or penetrating, non-penetrating, whatever your preferred vernacular is? This becomes more complex with some of the more complicated meters in the industry that have a wide variety of settings, where they actually have a setting specific to different species of wood, for example. If you have that type of instrument that you're using in your business, personally, my personal recommendation is the next time you have one of those Monday training sessions with all your staff, I would mandate that they do not change the wood setting. Use the default wood setting and do not change that setting beyond that point. Because if you do, and if Bob is setting it for softwood and Susan's setting it for hardwood, and that gets interchanged from day 1 to day 2 on that same inspection, you're going to get different values. You're going to make decisions based on progress or lack thereof, when that change had nothing to do with moisture. It had everything to do with the meter setting. So it's really critical to lock that down. Then you also need to lock down the location. And I'm going to give you some examples of how to do this. There are a broad variety of ways that we can do this, but that location really needs to be locked down. So where physically was that meter used, and where did you obtain that data from? And then finally, last but not least, your method of documentation also needs to be locked down. And what I mean by this is, how your technicians or your field staff are entering a value into whatever form or application or software you're using. They need to enter that information in the same way. And I'll give you an interesting example of this. One of the things that I see happen very frequently is when somebody's monitoring a
Hi, Brandon, can you hear us? I think we lost you. I'm sorry, everyone, we're experiencing some technical difficulties. Please hold. Hi, everyone. Please just bear with us 1 minute. We're experiencing some technical difficulties with Brandon's connection, and I will be back with you shortly. Hi, all. Brandon will be joining the line just in a minute now. We seem to be clearing up the issue. Thank you very much for your patience.
All right, I think I'm dialed back in. Could you confirm for me real quick, Matthew, you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now, and thank you, Brandon. I'll turn it back over to you.
All right, thank you very much. Yeah, so I'm not sure exactly where I dropped there. I apologize. But voice over internet on the phone, and my internet for some reason decided to drop real quick, so I'm dialed in on cell. So with that, where I left off on this particular slide, a recommendation to you as a business and how to manage this within your organization. So I would highly recommend that in your organization, at least on a weekly basis, you're spending time with your technical group, your field group, and you're spending at least 5 or 10 minutes, drawing out a topic, saying, as a business, here's how we do, this particular item, so that you can build that consistency in your business. And at least, once every couple of months, make sure that that topic is in and around how you monitor, specific building materials, what meter type you use, how you set up your settings, how you identify locations, and how that gets documented so that you can drive consistency in the business. And I've done this a lot with different organizations, and what I always find is that there's always an emotional tie from certain individuals to the way that they inspect certain materials. And I'm not sure where the emotional tie comes from, other than the fact that that's just the way they've always done it. So I always have to go through an explanation and help individuals understand that, there are a million right ways to check this wall on day 2. A lot of right ways to do it. And some ways are better than others, but they're all right. The only wrong way to do this, though, is different than the technician did it on day 1. That's the wrong way to do it. We have to be consistent, because if we're not consistent, then we can't identify progress. So I always have to preface with that conversation and help people understand that whether you're emotionally tied to one method of doing this or not, what I need everybody attached to is that we all have to do it the same way. And if we don't all do it the same way, then we're going to fail. We're going to fail on identifying problems. We're going to fail on justifying equipment. We're going to fail on validating our work. And that's going to lead to challenges in getting paid. It's going to lead to challenges in carrier conversations and customer conversations. So we all have to agree and sign up that we need to be on the same page. But I encourage you to do that and hit that nail as many times as you need to really drive that home in your business and in your organization. Right? So once we get through the monitoring process, we come into the final stage. And what's interesting about this is that we get back into inspection mode when we get into the final stage. So we start with inspection, the mentality of detail. Through the middle of the project, we put on the monitoring hat, consistency, not high frequency of locations, just consistency in the ones that we choose. Then finally, inspect. The reason why inspect is so important at the end is because it allows you to have fewer locations while you monitor. If I only check 3 locations in an entire bedroom for monitoring, that's okay as long as when I come into the inspection mode, I then expand my area and ensure that what I've been monitoring that now shows it's at or near a dry condition, that it is validated and consistent with the balance of that area, of that floor, or that wall, or whatever the assembly is. So you have to go back into inspection mode near the end because that's your final touch. That's the last opportunity that you have to, one, understand that you've brought the building back to a pre-loss condition, but also to memorialize it, to give yourself a permanent record so that if you're ever questioned about what condition you left the structure in, you have something authoritative to point to. So that's the 3-step workflow. With a 3-step workflow, just kind of recap that last step. It's a detailed process at the end. You expand the area of your meter use. You may even consider using things like, an ERH evaluation on really high-end materials or high sensitivity materials. I'm not going to get into the scope of what that is in this particular session. We can do that in a future session. But basically, this is using a hygrometer to validate that a material is not going to create a condition that'll secondarily damage neighboring materials. Very, very important when monitoring concrete. Okay, so if you're dealing with a lot of concrete slabs, for example, slab on grade construction or basement construction, or commercial structures that are built on slab, ERH evaluation is something your business needs to be good at. You need to make sure that's a skill set that you have. Obviously, we need to be very proficient in referencing and establishing dry standards in order to have the inspection process at the end play well. And last but not least, we should always obtain a certificate of completion and satisfaction from the customer. You should be establishing that drying goal up front. You should know what it is at the beginning of the job. It should be a part of your initial documentation that the customer has signed off on, and it should be something that they also sign on at the end saying that you've achieved that goal. So with all that said, let's get into an example of what that inspection process might look like. So I'm going to use a very, very basic example. Just a very simple, clean slate of a room here, not a whole lot of complexity going on. And I'm going to use the floor as an example of what inspection might look like, just specific to tracking water migration. And this is a process that many of you have probably partaken in more times than you care to count. But typically, we start from the area where we know the water has originated, at least into that room. And we use something like a moisture sensor. And we track that moisture migration out into that room until we find the edge, right? So the edge meaning that I've now placed the sensor into a substrate where I am not getting any indication of moisture. As we find that edge, then we work that edge, 3-dimensionally, in this case 2-dimensionally, because we're only talking about the floor surface initially, and we find that edge. Once I've found that edge, I need to document that edge. Remember, I need to document not only what is wet, I need to document what isn't wet. In terms of a moisture sensor, that doesn't mean you have a number that you're putting on your documentation. This can be as simple as our favorite blue tape demarcation on the floor and then snapping a picture of that so that I have that picture in my flood file. It indicates that, hey, I put this tape on the floor to indicate the edge of migration. I have a record now that I have discovered that edge of migration, and here's the delineation between what was affected and unaffected. Very important picture to have in the flood file. Once I've discovered that, I've now identified what is affected. The next step in the inspection is then to go into greater detail within that affected area and start to establish the locations where I'll monitor. And here's what that looks like. First, I need to understand what is the assembly comprised of? So I would need to look at this flooring surface. I need to look at the substrates beneath that flooring surface, understand the entire assembly. And in this case, let's say that what I've discovered is that we have a stretched-in carpet over a Revon carpet cushion, over 3/4 inch plywood, over a crawl space. Then the appropriate instrument selection might be something like this, a hammer probe. I'm going to go into one of these specific areas in the room, break it into quadrants. In this area that I have highlighted here, this might be 20 or 30 square feet. I'm going to use my hammer probe now to scan this area, taking multiple scans across this area, and identify the area where I want to monitor. Where am I going to lock down a location so that each of my technicians, when they come back tomorrow and the next day and the next day, are checking the same exact spot? My recommendation, identify the area with the highest number. So scan that area, identify the area in that zone with the highest number, and then mark that location with a piece of blue tape. That's one method. There are multiple methods for doing this and identifying the exact location for monitoring, especially when you get out towards the perimeter and you're dealing with wall assemblies. One of my favorite methods for doing that, if we're dealing with a wall assembly or a floor plate, is to actually put in a couple of fasteners just below the base trim, a couple of 3-inch wood screws. Just make sure that those 3-inch wood screws aren't hanging up on a piece of Berber carpet. That could cause some disaster. But if I do something like that and leave a fastener behind, then I know the exact location, and the depth even of that monitoring point will be held consistent from day 1 to day 2 to day 3. And that's something, if anybody's got questions on, I can definitely expand on a bit later if we have some time. But I demark the location here, identify exactly where my monitoring point is, then repeat that process in each one of these quadrants. Now again, the number of monitoring points that we're indicating across this floor does not need to be a great number. If you have one location in every 20 to 30 square feet, that's plenty. It's not about the quantity of locations, it's about the consistency by which we monitor those locations. And as long as I started with an inspection and identified the area of greatest concern, and then I finish with an inspection and ensure that the rest of this quadrant looks similar when I finish the project, then I can minimize the number of locations that I'm checking on a daily basis. But obviously we need to name those locations so they're set up well for whatever documentation system that we use. Now that's one assembly. I then need to repeat that process for each adjacent assembly that is in contact with my migration. So in this particular case, the most obvious here would be the wall assemblies. So now we need to repeat the process, start from the origination of water, work our way up the wall assembly, find out to what degree we're affected, document the degree of affected, document and delineate my areas of monitoring so that I can ensure that I monitor each of those locations in the same way, same instrument, same setting each day. In this particular example, it's really basic, it's really simple. However, most rooms or areas aren't that simple. There's going to be some sort of complexity somewhere throughout that room or throughout that loss. In this particular case, we have a small build-out assembly here in the back of the room. And this is just one example. This could be any number of different things. But it's very critical that when we come up against assemblies like this, that we continue that detailed inspection to identify exactly what these assemblies are comprised of. Now, this is here because it's hiding something. Now, something is occurring with this particular space. So what's behind this assembly and what's inside of this assembly? Are there interstitial cavities and voids? Is it covering up something that may have some pre-existing damage to it? I need to understand what that assembly is. That becomes critical, especially when the water has migrated up to this assembly's edge. So this is especially critical when we're dealing with things like cabinetry that has plumbing. And if this was not just an inset, if this was a cabinet with a sink, and we have a plumbing supply line here, and my water has migrated near, not even to, but near this edge, I would urge you to take a closer look at that assembly just to verify there isn't pre-existing damage. This also becomes important when those cavities create interstitial spaces and voids, areas that can trap bulk water. You've probably heard the phrase before that extraction is 1,200 times more efficient than evaporation. This is particularly true when we're dealing with interstitial cavities, where bulk water is not only trapped in keeping liquid water, but it's also inhibiting additional evaporation. That can cause a lot of secondary damage over time if it goes overlooked. It's also very critical when we're dealing with sensitive assemblies. When we are dealing with items that are built of materials or are comprised of materials that are more susceptible to water damage, it's even more critical that we give it a very critical eye to ensure that we understand whether or not they're affected. That's inspection. Now let's take a look in more detail at monitoring. So we established all of these different monitoring points. We've demarked where these monitoring points are. Now we have to control the variables as we move forward and monitor these locations. So again, in review, for the third time, stressing the importance of this list, we need to ensure that we have documented and we've memorialized what instrument is being used. Now again, my word of advice here, try to stick to the same inspection kit wherever possible. It really simplifies things. If you can't stick with the same inspection kit, that's fine. Then you need to implement in your business a process for validating your kits against each other. And that could be very, very simple. It's a clipboard that you keep back at the office where you store the instruments, and you got a block of wood sitting in that cabinet. And once every couple of months, you pull the kits out and you put kits A through F all in the same block of wood and make sure they measure the same thing. You document that they did, and then you put the clipboard away. And then you do it again every couple of months. It can be that simple. And just think about how critical that is for just a moment. If you have one kit in the batch that is way off in left field compared to the rest because, I'll call it experience has been a little bit different than the rest of your meters. It's been dropped a few more times. And you mix that kit in on, a $70,000, $80,000 water damage with high sensitive building materials. And that kit all of a sudden shows you're making great progress because it's measuring way lower than everything else. And you make decisions based on that, very critical decisions that could have implications on, the overall, loss exposure of tens of twenties of thousands of dollars. And then you come back a third day and find out that you're right back where you started again because now you're not using that kit. Number one, your documentation looks really fishy because you went from wet to dry to wet. So what the heck happened there? But then number two, you lost a whole 24 hours in mitigating the potential damage from a lack of progress. You lost 24 hours. How much exposure was created from that? All because of a very simple process not being implemented in your business. That's once every couple of months, spending 5 minutes checking your instruments against the same block of wood. Very simple process. And if it's not something that you're doing today and you're of a business size where you have no choice but to mix your meter kit, you really need to implement that process. We also need to lock down the setting and scale. The way you're going to do this is by having those Monday meetings with your team and locking down with everybody that this is the way we do it. I understand you may have done it differently in the past, but if you do it differently than Bob does it, then we're going to have no idea if we're drying or not, and we're a drying company. So I need everybody to be on the same page. You've got to have that discussion and have it on a regular basis. And then be able to lock down the exact location. I've had a lot of discussion about this locking down of the location, by the way, with a lot of different organizations and how they do it. One of the things that I've heard mentioned very, very frequently is that a lot of folks, what they'll do is they'll lay a piece of tape on the floor, but they'll also ensure that the monitoring location is approximately 1 inch off of that tape. And there's some good science behind that because the tape acts as a bit of a vapor barrier. So being just a bit off of the tape with the actual location where you stick your pins in the floor or whatever else is probably not a bad idea. All right. And then last but not least, the documentation method. You've got to make sure that everybody's on the same page for the method by which they document the information. So in review, the 3-step workflow, we start with inspect. It's detailed. We're gathering a lot of information. We're reading section 10 of the ANSI S500 and making sure that our documentation checklists include everything that is mentioned in the S500. In inspection, we identify several monitoring points. Then we monitor those locations consistently. Same meter, same settings, same location, driving that home in the business, making sure our instruments are in agreement with one another or that we're using the same instrument on the same project on a daily basis. And then we finish the process by verifying the target condition. We expand out from the monitoring point. We again check multiple locations within that quadrant and verify that that assembly is in agreement with the monitoring location that we've been using over the previous several days. So that's documentation and documenting with purpose. Hopefully that simplified some of the technical in the process for you. A couple of the real key takeaways I want to make sure that I stress through that is just how important it is to build consistency in your business. It's a process that will require some time and attention and investment. However, it is something that will pay off dividends for you at some point. So I highly encourage that you do that. If you have questions, I see that a couple of them have posted up here. I'm going to scan through those in the chat, but I also want to put this up on the board just so you have it as we go through these. I am the vice chair of the ANSI IICRC S500. I serve on a committee that is updating that document as we speak. So if you do have any questions that you ever want to throw out at me that are related to any other subject matter on the S500, please feel free. I'm always available by email, which is up on screen. Okay. Now, to run into the chat box, I do see a couple of questions that came in, and Matt, I'm going to kind of bounce back and forth with you on this. I'll take the first one, and if you see any others that you think we need to address here, feel free to hit those for me while I'm hitting this first one. But one of the questions was whether or not the presentation was going to be available. And I know, Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, but this presentation in its entirety is actually recorded and is available for download to certified firms. Is that correct?
That's correct. It actually will be hosted on the IICRC website in the certified firm section. So usually takes us about 24 hours to get it up there. So anytime after that, you can direct your team members to that section of the website to view the webinar.
Got it. Yeah, and actually I scanned through and I don't see any other questions that came in on the way through. So I think either we addressed everybody's questions well as we were going through, or everybody's being really shy. One of the two.
I see one other one, Brandon. If you'd like, I can read it to you.
Yeah, go ahead.
The question is, why would you just monitor specific spots and not all areas affected? In my experience, different areas can dry at different rates because we do not know where water may be held up inside walls or in low areas.
Got it. That's a great question. So there are two things that I would supply as an answer to that. The first is that if you set your inspection process up to be detailed enough, you should be able to identify the wettest areas and areas of greatest concern to locate your monitoring point to. That's what supports, cutting back on the number of locations. If you also do the same thing towards the end of the process, when you're approaching your dry standard and you're nearing your drying goal, it's going to be critical for you to cast a wider net again and just validate that the rest of the assembly is marking the same way as your monitoring point. And again, my frequency recommendation is once every 20 to 30 square feet. That's still a pretty high frequency. If you're dealing with a couple hundred square foot in a living room and doing a monitoring point every 20 to 30 square feet, you're still going to be at 10, 11, 12 monitoring locations across the field of the example, the field of the floor. That's still a pretty good high number. My concern is that if you get much higher than that, and you're trying to document, every 5, 10 square feet of an assembly, the amount of documentation required is going to minimize the amount of time you're spending at each location, and your consistency is going to take a hit. And to me, the consistency is far more critical because it's the progress that you need to be able to document. If you can't document and show progress, then validating your methods is going to become challenging, and identifying problems is going to become challenging. Good question. Very good question. Having said that, if your business is set up to be very consistent with a greater frequency of locations, great. More power to you as long as the consistency is not taking a hit.
Okay, we've got another question. What do you do if a meter breaks during the job after initial inspection and monitoring?
Same brand, same make. Same make, same model. So if you're using a Survey Master as an example, and that's what you set up your project on, and that meter for whatever reason becomes unavailable or inoperable, hopefully you've got another Survey Master back at the office. Most companies use one of 3 different brands on instruments, and as long as what you're doing is staying consistent with a brand in your business, then there should be another one back at the office. If your operation only had one of a particular instrument, that's all you've got in your inventory, and that meter goes out on you and you come back the next day and you have no choice but to use a different meter type, then I'm going to give you 2 answers. Answer number 1 is you have to hit a restart on your documentation because you're not really going to be able to compare day 1 to day 2 and just live with the fact that you're not going to be able to make that comparison. And then the second thing I'm going to give you is you need to buy a second meter because you should not be relying on a single instrument in your business. because that's going to happen. You're going to have failures of critical systems, and critical systems need backups. Right, good question. Right. And just to kind of take onto that real quickly, if you make that commitment in your business, really step back and think about that for just a quick second. You really should be using the same make and model of instrument throughout your kits. And that can be difficult because every once in a while you have to change for one reason or another. But don't buy, brand X just because that one looks, cool and different. You really got to weigh the cost of having to update the rest of your arsenal if you decide to change brands.
Okay. Another question that we have is, as far as for everyone using the same method of documentation, what are some tips you could give to get people that have been doing their own method for years?
Well, I'm going to give the simple answer, and then probably the more real answer. The simple answer is mandated. It's a requirement of the business. In order for you to be an effective drying business, that consistency has to be there. So you sit everybody down in the room, and I've done this. On consultation, I've done this with restoration firms that had 16 or 17 technicians that had a broad variety of the way they were doing things. In one case in particular, what I recall was this was a company that had acquired another business. So you had two entirely different companies that were merging under one brand that had two entirely different philosophies for how to do things. And they were mixing these technicians together on the same projects. Very, very strong emotional investment in one method versus the other. And we just had to sit down and have a real honest conversation about the importance of consistency and say, look, and I find this statement to be very effective. There are a number of right ways to check that wall, or to check that floor, or to check that item. There's a number of right ways to do it, but there's only one wrong way. And what we all need to do is agree that this way is wrong. The wrong way is different than it was done on day one. Let's all agree that that's the wrong way. And you get everybody to buy in on that simple agreement. Say, okay, if we all agree on that, we all agree we're a professional drying company, then we all agree we have to do it the same way. So, I don't care if you draw straws or, give a thumb war or what you do, let's pick one. And once we pick one, I need everybody to leave their emotions behind. We're now invested in that method. And it's going to be mandated that we use that method, and not using that method is going to cause damage to the company. So we need to commit. You just have to have an honest conversation about it. And I think most people, when they understand the impact of not being consistent, most are going to buy into the fact that it needs to be consistent. It's just having the method the manner of choosing that one method and how not to step on too many people's hurt feelings. And sometimes that means just having it come down from the top, unfortunately.
Okay. Our next question is, because of the migration of water through wood during the drying process, how can you be certain that you will not miss a hot spot if only monitoring the same spot throughout?
Again, it's the inspection, monitoring, inspection, right? I need detail to start. I need consistency in my monitoring through the middle, and then I need inspection again at the end. There will always be a risk that in my inspection in the end, I'm going to find things that were not on my monitoring radar throughout. There's always a risk of that for a number of different reasons. But if you start with detail, you drive consistency through the middle, and then you finish with detail or begin detail as you approach the finish line, then you're not going to miss those items. You won't miss them, at least at the end, of what you felt was the end, and have to make an adjustment. Again, the primary reason for trying to focus in on fewer locations through the middle of the project is so that you afford the ability to be consistent with your process. I would argue that consistency is critical because you need to make adjustments if you're not making the progress that you want to make.
Okay, but this is our final question here. If you're using screws or nails, how accurate are they on depth of moisture, i.e. sill plate? How deep do you drive the screw?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when you're using an uninsulated fastener, a nail, screw of any type is an uninsulated fastener. What I mean by that is, the entire shank of the screw or nail is acting as a moisture probe, and you place two of those into a wall plate and then place your instrument in contact with those two probes. When you do that, you don't know how deep the moisture is. All you know, if you get a 50 on your instrument, is that somewhere along the depth of those two shanks, there is a material that is measuring 50 that's making contact with both of those fasteners. So you don't have a depth indication when you're using a fastener like that. What you have is you have the wettest of the depth that you've achieved. Now, in terms of how deep would I go, I would like personally, if I'm checking a wall plate, I want to use at least a 3-inch wood screw because I want to achieve a minimum of 50% depth into that assembly, so I can get close to the area where the moisture is going to have the most difficult time traveling out. That also is deeper than I would typically get with something like a hammer probe, which is only going to give me about 1.5 inches by the time you allow for any baseboard or anything else that's in the way. So I'm getting a much deeper data set, if you will, than I would get from my traditional handheld probes. There are a number of other devices that you can use, though. If you have a thicker assembly, one of my favorite go-tos is a couple of drill bits, and using something that'll go even deeper into the assembly if I'm concerned about moisture deeper in the assembly and drying that assembly more thoroughly throughout, especially when you get into things like beams and glue lams and things like that that have a much greater depth. And if the moisture has been exposed to them long enough, that I'm concerned about moisture penetration into the core of that assembly. With something like that, you have a much greater control over how deep you're going. But again, you don't know where the moisture is. All you know if you're getting a 50 is that there's a 50 somewhere. But you know if you had a 50 on day 1 and it's 30 on day 2 and it's 20 on day 3, that it's drying. Good questions.
Okay, we've got 2 more minutes. Do we have any other final questions, please?
Right. So if you don't mind, I'll just mention I appreciate all the very, very good technical questions. And a lot of those types of questions, those are all things that are also really good to press on to the S500 committee as they write through the S500 document. So I just want to leave with a shameless pitch for knowing that your industry standard document is an update process, and hopefully this committee gets a lot of feedback from the industry at large.
Couple last final questions here. We've got 2 minutes while we've got you. One question is, what about evaporation potential and documenting it?
So evaporation potential would be more in line with your psychrometric documentation, which is an entirely different bucket of documentation. Evaporation potential in and of itself is just one method of calculating, the ability or the probability of drying. There are a number of methods for doing so, so I wouldn't necessarily prescribe one method or another. However, documenting the conditions you've created and the temperature of building materials and how well that supports drying is something that I could definitely recommend we put into one of these future webinars. I think it would be a very good topic to address. And it's important in all mitigation projects, but it becomes more critical the greater the urgency of that drying duration. And there are definitely factors that influence that. I wouldn't break out temperature measurement and drying potential measurement or my material vapor pressure more specifically. I wouldn't break all of that out for a $500 water damage, but I would definitely break it out if I was drying the Smithsonian. So I'm being a little bit exaggerative there, but there are definitely places for it.
And then one final one, can you elaborate more on ERH, please?
ERH is equilibrium relative humidity, and ERH is a method that is used for evaluating the amount of moisture in a material by the humidity that it supports at its surface. It's directly related to water activity, and water activity is the moisture available for microbial growth. I would actually argue at the end of the day that you're drying a building and a building material so that when you are done, the moisture in materials will not support an ERH that is at risk of causing damage. That's actually, if you really want to define the goal of drying a building and the target moisture level, the best way to do it is by the ERH that it will support when you pull off the job. And again, if in the future we have an opportunity to dig into the psychrometric measurements associated with water mitigation, I can definitely expand on that because it's a message you're going to hear more and more in the industry. Even in the S500 itself, the current section on drying goals even discusses the value of ERH, if you read through your section 10 of the S500.
Okay, no more questions. And thank you very much, Brandon, for your time this afternoon and for a wonderful presentation. Thank you, everybody, for joining the IICRC Certified Firm webinar program.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.